All right, so we got some pretty intense research this time around.
Yeah.
A draft paper all about the history of medical schools in the U.S.
Uh-huh.
And the author really dives deep into Georgia Medical College and Atlanta Medical College.
Okay.
And it seems like what they're really trying to get at is, you know, the truth about the uglier parts of American medical history, especially as it relates to race and exploitation.
It's definitely a side of medical history that a lot of people don't talk about.
Right.
It's kind of swept under the rug.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So let's kind of set the stage here.
Yeah.
We're talking 18th and 19th centuries, a time when, medical schools were popping up all over the place.
Right.
And the demand for cadavers was just
Oh, yeah.
through the roof, right, for all these anatomy lessons and research. But getting those bodies legally was a whole other story.
Yeah, there's a whole other can of worms.
Right.
Yeah, there were so many laws and religious beliefs that made it incredibly difficult.
Totally. And so you're basically saying that this created this massive shortage,
Yeah, a huge shortage.
which in turn led to a black market for bodies.
Exactly, supply and demand, right?
It's wild. And so this need for bodies basically opened the door for some seriously unethical practices.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter for sure.
So let's talk about that.
Oh, okay.
What were some of those shady practices?
Well, a lot of medical schools took advantage of the situation.
Okay.
Especially in the South.
Uh-huh.
They really preyed on Black communities.
This is where it gets really disturbing. Right?
Yeah.
We're talking grave robbing.
I'm afraid so.
It's unreal.
Yeah. Medical schools were robbing graves in Black cemeteries.
Just unbelievable.
And to make matters worse, the authorities often turned a blind eye.
Because the victims were black.
Exactly. They just didn't care.
It's heartbreaking.
Eh.
It really makes you think about how deeply ingrained systemic racism was back then.
Yeah, it was just woven into the fabric of society.
I mean, black people were seen as less than human, even in death.
That's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
It was a time when dehumanizing Black people was so widespread,
Right.
and that made it easier for these people in power to justify these horrible acts.
All right, so let's get into the specifics about the schools you mentioned in the beginning.
Okay.
Starting with Georgia Medical College, which is now known as the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta.
Right.
So tell me about them.
Well, they were facing the same problem that everybody else was facing.
The cadaver shortage.
Exactly. And the research suggests that they went to some pretty extreme lengths to solve it.
Okay.
I mean, there are reports of widespread grave robbing from Black cemeteries in Augusta.
Wow, and I can only imagine the outrage and the pain they caused in the black community
Oh, it must have been devastating.
to have your loved ones' graves desecrated like that.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine.
But it sounds like this wasn't just about stealing bodies for anatomical study.
Well, you're picking up on something there.
I mean, the research hints at something even darker.
Yeah, there are allegations of the school using enslaved people
Yeah.
for live experiments without anesthesia.
This is awful.
And they tried to justify these actions by saying that they were necessary for medical progress.
Progress.
That's sickening.
It's a truly disturbing thought.
How could they possibly think that that was okay?
It shows how intertwined scientific advancement and racial injustice really were.
Yeah, I mean, they saw Black bodies as disposable,
Right.
like tools for their research.
They were completely dehumanized.
This is horrifying.
Yeah, it's a dark part of our history.
All right, so let's move on to Atlanta Medical College, which eventually became Emory University School of Medicine.
Right.
What happened there?
Well, they were also involved in grave robbing.
Oh, no.
There's one specific incident that was mentioned in the research.
Yeah.
The robbing of graves at Southview Cemetery.
And that was a burial ground for African Americans.
That's right. So was there any accountability for this? Were those responsible ever held to justice?
You know what? They weren't. There was strong evidence, but the medical students involved faced no real consequences.
Oh, my gosh.
Which really shows you the power dynamics at play, you know?
Yeah.
Black lives were simply not valued the same as white lives.
So we're seeing this pattern of exploitation repeat itself over and over.
It's a tragic pattern.
But Atlanta Medical College's role in perpetuating racist medical myths is especially disturbing to me.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. So the research you sent points to faculty at the college conducting studies
Okay.
that were aimed at proving that there were biological differences between Black and white people.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and those studies were completely unfounded.
Right.
But they were used to justify segregation
Oh.
and discrimination in healthcare.
So they were basically trying to create a scientific basis for racism.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's exactly what they were doing.
I can't believe it.
It was part of this larger movement of scientific racism, which sought to legitimize the idea that Black people were inferior.
Wow. It's just hard to believe that these so-called scientists were so blinded by prejudice that they would manipulate data to fit their own racist worldview.
Yeah, it's a really dark chapter in the history of science.
And the fact that these ideas persisted for so long is infuriating.
I know, it's unbelievable.
And the impact of these beliefs is still being felt today.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the medical racism that was so embedded
Yeah.
in the foundation of these institutions
It's still with us.
has had a long-lasting impact.
A very long-lasting impact.
You know, it's contributed to this mistrust of the medical system that we see in many Black communities even now.
It's like a wound that hasn't healed.
Yeah, it's like this dark history is casting a long shadow over everything.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, it makes it even harder to address these issues today.
We can't escape the past.
Oh.
It's still very much present when we're talking about healthcare and race.
This is a lot to take in.
Yeah.
I think we need to pause here for a second and just let all of this sink in.
Take a deep breath.
What we've uncovered so far is truly disturbing.
It is, but it's important that we face these uncomfortable truths head on.
If we want to move towards a more just and equitable healthcare system.
Exactly. We can't shy away from the hard stuff.
Okay, so when we come back, we'll dive back into this and explore what steps are being taken to acknowledge this painful past and what more needs to be done to dismantle the legacy of medical racism.
Sounds good.
Stay with us.
You know, it's important to remember that these weren't just isolated incidents. This was a whole system of exploitation.
It was widespread.
Targeting Black communities.
Yeah, it wasn't just about a few bad apples.
Right.
This research really shows us how there was this whole web of institutions and policies and societal norms
Absolutely.
that were all tangled up in this horrible injustice.
Yeah. One thing that really stood out to me was how these medical schools tried to justify their actions by using this language of science and progress.
It's almost like they were trying to hide behind those fancy words and ideas.
Yeah, they were definitely trying to make themselves sound better than they were.
To make what they were doing seem less awful.
Exactly. They were using the idea of scientific advancement as a shield to deflect any kind of criticism and avoid accountability.
And to completely ignore
Right.
the basic human rights
Of course.
of the Black people that they were exploiting.
That's exactly right. It was all about dehumanization.
Yeah.
They convinced themselves they were doing something noble.
In the name of science.
Yeah, for the greater good.
It's just sickening.
It's a really disturbing part of our history.
And the fact that this went on for so long with barely any opposition
No, it's mind-boggling.
is just mind-boggling.
The power dynamics were so out of balance.
Right.
Black communities had very little power to challenge these injustices.
And the people in power just looked the other way.
They were complicit.
So basically they got away with it because of the color of their skin.
And the color of their victim's skin.
It's a stark reminder of how deeply embedded systemic racism was in society back then.
Yeah, the system was designed to protect the powerful.
And leave marginalized communities vulnerable.
Absolutely vulnerable to this kind of horrific abuse.
It's like this dark history is a stain that we just can't erase.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And it's a stain that continues to impact us today.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when it comes to healthcare.
Right.
I mean, the mistrust that many African Americans feel towards the medical system
It's understandable.
is a direct result of these historical injustices.
It's a direct consequence.
We can't just talk about mistrust, though.
Right.
We have to acknowledge the real-world consequences
Absolutely.
of that mistrust.
Like what?
Well, the research highlights studies
Yeah.
that show how this mistrust can lead to Black patients receiving inadequate care, delayed diagnoses, and even higher mortality rates for certain conditions.
Yeah, it's a serious problem.
It's like this history is a ghost that's still haunting us today.
It's very much alive.
And it's not just about individual experiences.
Right.
This legacy of medical racism has seeped into our public health policy.
Of their research funding.
Our research funding.
Our access to healthcare for entire communities.
It's a systemic problem.
It is.
That requires a systemic response.
We can't just sweep it under the rug and pretend it never happened. We have to confront it.
Acknowledge the pain.
Acknowledge the pain.
That was caused.
And take real steps.
And take steps.
To address the inequalities that still exist today.
So let's talk about solutions.
Okay.
What can we actually do?
Yeah, what can we do?
To repair this damage and build a healthcare system.
Right.
That's truly equitable.
That's the million-dollar question.
I know.
There's no easy answer.
Right.
But there are some encouraging approaches that people are exploring.
Okay, give me some hope here.
All right.
What are some of those approaches?
Well, for starters, medical schools are starting to acknowledge their role in perpetuating medical racism.
Good.
Some are incorporating this history into their curricula.
Okay.
And others are creating programs specifically designed to address racial disparities in healthcare.
That's a good first step.
It is a good first step.
But is it enough?
Probably not.
To just acknowledge the past?
Right.
Don't we need to see some concrete actions?
You're absolutely right. Acknowledgement without action is meaningless.
It has to be followed up with real change.
Real, tangible change.
So what does that kind of meaningful action look like?
It could look like increasing diversity in the medical profession, investing in research that focuses on these health disparities, and creating healthcare systems that are truly culturally competent and responsive to the needs of all communities.
These all sound like good ideas.
They do.
But I can imagine there's going to be some pushback.
Oh, absolutely.
Changing a system as entrenched as healthcare is never easy.
It's going to be an uphill battle.
Right.
It'll take a sustained effort, political will, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Speaking of challenging the status quo, this research mentions Emory University. And their efforts to confront its past ties to medical racism.
Right. They've taken some steps to acknowledge their involvement in these practices.
So it's encouraging.
It is encouraging.
To see institutions starting to grapple with their history.
Right. Even when it's painful.
Even when it's painful. But how do we know?
That's the question.
That these efforts aren't just for show.
Right. How do we ensure that they're really committed to making a difference?
Right.
Actions speak louder than words.
For sure.
We need to see concrete changes in policies and practices and outcomes.
So it's not about empty apologies
No.
or symbolic gestures.
Not at all.
It's about building a system
Yeah.
where everyone, regardless of race or background, has equal access to quality health care.
Absolutely.
And feels safe and respected within that system.
That's the goal.
That's a powerful vision.
It is.
But achieving that vision requires more than just the efforts of medical institutions.
More than just hospitals and doctors.
What role do everyday people play in this process?
That's a great question, and we'll explore that in more detail after a quick break.
So we were talking about how dismantling medical racism isn't just a job for doctors and politicians. It's something we all have a responsibility to work towards.
It's a collective effort.
Right.
It requires a change in mindset across society.
So where do we even begin? What can everyday people do to make a real difference?
I think one of the most powerful things we can do is educate ourselves about this history of medical racism.
Knowledge is power. Right.
Exactly. The more we understand how these injustices came to be, the better equipped we'll be to challenge them.
The more we can do to actually change them.
Right. And there are so many resources available to us now.
Like what?
I mean, read books and articles.
Okay.
Listen to podcasts.
Yes.
Engage in conversations about these issues with your friends and family.
Right.
Even this research that you sent us is a great place to start.
Yeah, it's definitely been eye-opening for me.
Good.
But beyond education, there's some concrete actions.
You want to get your hands dirty?
Yeah. I want to know what I can do.
Okay. Well, we can advocate for policies that address racial disparities in healthcare. Contact your elected officials.
Right.
Support organizations that are working to improve healthcare access in underserved communities.
Got it.
And use your voice to demand change.
So it's about turning our awareness into action.
Exactly.
Using our voices and our votes.
To push for a more just system.
Absolutely. But change also starts at a personal level. I mean, we can all examine our own biases and assumptions about race and healthcare.
You hit the nail on the head.
Right.
We all have implicit biases, even if we're not aware of them.
Yeah, and those biases can affect how we interact with healthcare providers.
Right.
And even how we understand medical information.
Absolutely. So it's about being more self-aware, and questioning our own assumptions.
Right.
Be mindful of how our own perceptions, experiences might be shaped by race and privilege.
That's a good point.
And if we see instances of bias or discrimination, we can't stay silent.
Right. We got to speak up.
We have to speak up and challenge them.
So it sounds like being an ally in healthcare is a lot like being an ally in any other area of life.
Exactly.
It's about listening.
Learning.
And being willing to use our privilege to amplify marginalized voices.
You said it perfectly. It's about recognizing that healthcare is a fundamental human right.
Not a privilege.
Not a privilege. And working to make sure that everyone has equal access to the care they need.
Well, this conversation has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
You know, it's been hard to confront this dark side of medical history.
Yeah, but it's also been inspiring to learn about all the ways that people are working towards a better future.
Right, a more just and equitable future.
Absolutely.
Well said.
Thank you.
Seems like we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We unearthed some difficult truths.
We did.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, shoot.
You know, knowing this history, what responsibility do we all have as individuals and as a society to repair the harm caused by medical racism and ensure a more equitable healthcare system for everyone?
That's a great question.
It is. It's a question worth reflecting on.
It is.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.